Good day, Brigade. This is Bahbi, and today we're going to be going a little bit into education, the education system, and some things we believe direly need reformed in it and changed. Also included, we're going to be discussing a little bit here, a bit of a hot take on a little bit of news I'm sure you're all probably familiar with at this point, and the Supreme Court leak that occurred. Yeah. So, naturally, pretty much everyone's in an uproar about this. Liberals and Democrats mostly against the idea of the Supreme Court straight up overturning Roe v. Wade and turning what should be the right of all women into a states' rights issue, saying that, basically making an argument that a state institution has more rights than a person. Yeah. And on the right, you got Republicans and MAGA hatters going crazy over the idea of, oh my god, how did this leak? This is a compromised system and all that kind of crap. And it's like, yeah, but it's something you like. Are you telling us that you wanted to pull the wool over everyone's eyes and try to screw people over? 'Cause, wow. It should also be important to note that just because Scalia's thing got out and his little argument to try to get people to favor it and judges and all that is not a final statement. This is not the final statement of the court, and there's still much deliberation that has to be done. In fact, dissertations and all that kind of stuff is very common within the Supreme Court to kind of try to sway some of the judges over to your side or against your side. Because the more firmly that you have a decision in place, the better it looks historically. As you can see, there are many 5-4 decisions in the recent past of the Supreme Court that many people are like, overturn this, overturn that. In fact, I think Roe v. Wade is actually one of those. Anywho, we're going to tell you a little bit on our personal views on this. First off, who the fuck are you as an institution of any kind to tell anybody what they have the right to do with their bodies? Secondly, why the fuck is it that a male-dominated organization thinks they have the right to tell women how their bodies should work, function, and what they should do with them? It's a bit fucked up when you think about it. Third, why the fuck do you care what other people do with their lives if this is a matter of religion for you? Okay, so even if you believe that abortion is a murder and you have just saw someone get an abortion and believe that they have killed an unborn life. This in itself is a huge debate, by the way. We can go over that in a little bit. That doesn't affect you. It doesn't affect your life, your faith, or your anything. I'm pretty sure your God's gonna be okay with you as long as you're not the one doing it if it's against your beliefs. I don't think your God really wants you to go out and force your beliefs onto other people. I think you actually had some complaints about that before. I think you argued that schools and other things, and Black Lives Matter and other organizations of the such are indoctrinating people? You don't see this as a form of indoctrination? You don't see this as a, you have to believe in my way or go fuck yourself? Freedom is all well and good, children, but don't get me wrong. When freedom starts to impede on others' liberty, it is no longer freedom. It is just insanity. Anywho, as a man, I don't believe I have any choice in the matter. And I'm going to give you a fair warning, this is going to get a bit explicit, aside from the already profane coverage here. We're going to give you a bit of a gross argument here, but it's an argument all the same, and it kind of actually holds merit. Anyways, our argument, aside from the obvious ones, is that, let's say you're a man who has sex with a woman, and you impregnate that woman. There is still no reason you have any choice over this child. Now, one might argue, well, my DNA created at very least half of it, arguably, therefore I should have at least half a say. Yes, but you're wrong. And why are you wrong? Because we go back to the act of sex. And I do apologize for those of you who might find this a bit uncomfortable. You can go ahead and skip ahead to the second part of the episode if this is what bothers you, because this is basically going to be up until the end. Anyway, it's something you have just given to them. In exchange for pleasure, you have given them literally part of your DNA to do with what they will. Now they could choose to keep this and carry it to come to term for a child, or they can choose to end this whole thing and not have a child. You know, kind of like if someone were to come up to you with a piano player, who is an amazing piano player, by the way, like, let's say the greatest in the world. Like, hands down, this guy or gal, doesn't matter who, is going to change the world of music with their piano playing. But there's a stipulation to this. This person can only live if they are attached to somebody physically. Like, say, anybody. Here comes the question that we have for you. Do you have to accept someone offering having that piano player attached to you? In other words, do you have the obligation to have that piano player connected to you in order to keep that piano player alive? Now, I'm pretty sure a good chunk of you, if not most of you, would probably say, no, because I'm not obligated to keep alive the life of another. Unless, of course, that person is my actual child. But here's the kicker to that. It's not a full child yet. It's not a born life. It is not a confirmed life. And arguably, we're not even entirely sure what life would be yet. I mean, you can quite reasonably, using the basic scientific parameters of life, argue that infants are not life forms. They can't really look after themselves. They can't acquire their own food. They can't acquire their own water. They can't build or produce their own shelter, find their own shelter. They're essentially helpless meat sacks. In fact, weirdly enough, I actually went to the University of Colorado at Boulder for college, and their philosophy department was actually headed by a man who could reasonably argue, I might add, and it was kind of scary how reasonably, that no, infanticide is not morally wrong. Now I think we're all going to be like, hold on! But his reasoning there was that an infant isn't capable of performing the basic functions of life on its own, or getting the basic needs of life on its own, or performing the basic functions 100% on its own, and therefore could be argued not a life. Now this is getting a little unsettling for some of you, I'm sure, but going back to the piano player analogy, you are not required to keep any life alive. I mean, you might feel a personal moral obligation to keep some life alive, like a pet or a thing like that, but if it is someone straight up offering you something to keep alive, you are under no obligation or requirement to take that individual or thing that needs someone to take care of it to be alive, or to hold it yourself. You don't have that obligation. Anybody else can carry that piano player. It's not like they couldn't go find somebody else who would. There is always that possibility in this experiment. But the fact remains, the fact that you feel you have the right to tell someone that they have to do this with their body because you gave them a quote-unquote gift, it's sexist, misogynistic, irrational, and just straight up inconsiderate of other people. And if you want to tie this back into the freedom versus liberty thing, you're free to have sex and be with whoever the hell you want. But once that freedom of yours starts impeding on their liberty to do what they will with their life, it's no longer freedom, it's oppression of you to another. Anyways, let's go ahead into our lighter subject matter and get on with the show. Alrighty, if you're still with us, thank you very much, or if you just happen to skip our little ditty about abortion, that's totally fine too. You're all entitled to your right to listen to whatever the hell you want, and to be honest, it got pretty freaking vulgar. Anywho, we're going to go back into our main subject for what was going to be for, I guess, technically last week, but due to a whole personal emergency and issues, we had to put off that episode. Anyways, here we go to the schools. So, what's currently wrong with our schools? Well, the current education system's in pretty bad shape, honestly. Between its outdated and outmoded model and teaching materials and all sorts of other crap, and the tyranny of misguided hyper-partisan politicians injecting their own half-baked ideology and removing that which makes them, quote, uncomfortable. Ron DeSantis. What? It kind of becomes a no-brainer that this education system's not so much an education system as much as a state-funded, sophisticated, quasi-educational daycare. Wow, that was actually remarkably catchy. Anyway, this daycare of sorts is pretty freaking bad. So what specifically is wrong with it? Well, the current system relies heavily on outdated equipment like we mentioned earlier. For example, I myself have had to use textbooks from anywhere from the late 70s, early 80s, and if we were lucky, we got a couple textbooks from past 1991. Now you might be wondering, why do you say past 1991? Well, most of my history textbooks and social study textbooks actually still portrayed the Soviet Union as a living political entity. And its satellite states were just part of it. Yeah, that's kind of a problem. So, there's that, and if we're lucky, they've upgraded past the 90s in most of these schools by now, but unfortunately, education funding between individual states varies, and if you're lucky, you might get a small chunk of the budget pie for your state. More often than not, though, you're working with bake sale money, fundraising money, PTA hopes, and all that sort of crap. And oh my god, it's horrible. At least when you're talking about rural schooling. Urban schools, I've found, actually tend to have much more of a... Well, again, this kind of varies depending on where you're at, because there's still things like redlining and things that have led to an incredibly unequal urban environment. But if you're in the more white bread parts of your urban center, so to speak, you do tend to have a much more effective and much more updated school. So much so that you can actually do modern shit. This is not true of inner city schools, low income schools, or even just rural schools though. You don't get that stuff. Because a lot of states like to focus their money on what they consider successful educational institutions, i.e. mostly white schools. And it's not just specifically mostly white, but mostly middle to upper class white. But of course your upper class white people tend to go more private schools anyway. And it's not us making an assumption here, this is actually kind of a real thing. Your more upper class white people will tend to go to private schooling as opposed to the public education system because many of the upper class are fully aware of the flaws of the current education system. So, what are some other wrong issues? There's the severely underpaid teaching staff. Now you might be thinking, well, they can't be that underpaid, right? Sadly, this is actually true. We're talking about to the point of where even the passion of teaching isn't enough incentive for people to go into education. It's not enough to actually want to teach. It's such a poor wage, poor conditioned job that there are a lot of people I know who actually went to college for education and ended up going and working in a grocery store instead because it A, pays better, B, has better benefits, and C, the passion of teaching just isn't enough to cover those first two, in addition to the incredibly undisciplined and basically daycare nature of the public education system. It's just not enough. it limits the system's abilities to hire the best, at best, and in reality kind of leaves you with this shitty situation where nobody wants to teach, nobody wants to learn, and yeah, it's literally just a publicly funded gigantic daycare. Now, it's not the only thing that's wrong. The base national curriculum itself can pretty much be thrown out the window too. Why? Because its individual sections can be widely interpreted to have some of it be completely meaningless. For example, in high school, I didn't even have to take a physical ed course for my last couple of years because the state of Iowa decided that marching band's a sport. Now, don't get me wrong, it does take a bit of physical effort to be in a band and do marching and all that, but let's see, between playing a game of football and marching in the band's a bit easier. And if you know who I am, that's actually a pretty amazing statement. I do not care for football at all. And marching band is a pain at best. But I digress. State and local jurisdictions also have an unusually high influence and control within this education system, and many of them are starting to adopt ideological positions and points, and even so far as there have been laws introduced to basically spy on teachers during class. For example, the state of Iowa, again, we're bringing up Iowa, had Governor Kim Reynolds propose and even go as far as to try to get into law a bill that would actually require cameras to be in all classrooms to make sure that, quote, sensitive subjects aren't being talked about. In other words, you can't talk about the history of America's racism, you can't talk about specific subjects that might make people feel uncomfortable. In the state of Florida, if you're a kid with gay parents, you can't talk about your parents. Like, at all. It is very clearly an ideological bent based on a quasi-fascist populism. A populism that's terribly misguided into thinking that Floridian authoritarianism is an acceptable approach to life. Sorry, Florida, but you kind of have some tyrants right now. With all these factors combined, it shouldn't be no wonder that the current education system is an old, broken concept that basically repeats the same few basic knowledge points from, if you're lucky, the 1980s. Woo! Reaganomics! And only adding a little bit more with each subsequent year. Do you know how long it took me to learn about the Franco-Prussian War? Yeah, it didn't take me until a certain grade. No. They don't discuss that in most schools. They don't discuss one of the major wars that was a prelude to the First World War in history classes. Now, is it a matter of they just simply don't have time, or they just decided it's not that important? I don't know. But a major fucking premise that leads to the beginning of Germanic nationalism forming a full-on actual German state called Germany, being a prelude to the First World War and an inspiration for why the Allies were so freaking hard in the goddamn Treaty of Versailles. But no, that's not important to know in high school. Nah. That was something I actually had to look up on my own to understand. Because the American education system is, again, that bad. It's almost a fucking crime against humanity. So, what do we propose? Well, aside from teaching Americans what their individual state looks like on a map without a label, seriously, this is something that a lot of Americans can't point out, we need to start making teaching a worthwhile job again. This means removing cameras if you have them, paying a wage that actually allows teaching to be a career rather than having to be one of 2 or 3, 4 or 5 even jobs that a teacher has to take on, such as working in fast food, working in a grocery store, or any other unskilled labor because their skills lie in education. But importantly, you need to actually trust these people you put in charge of your children's education. You need to start treating them with some goddamn respect. And again, international audiences and people who might find the profanity a little bit rude or vulgar or might not understand what the hell I'm talking about, I do apologize, but please, look this up because it's a horrible, horrible problem that many tyrannical politicians are taking serious advantage of to screw you, the people. Sorry, we've got a bit of strong feelings on this. Secondly, we need to introduce an Intro to Logic course being mandatory in the early years of education. Do you know how not mandatory it is? My school didn't have any philosophy class. Well, if it did, anyway, it was a very basic Intro to Philosophy class that you could take in your second to third year of high school. You know, by the time you should have probably already learned basic logic, reasoning, the overall fallacies that one could pose, and, you know, all the basics about thinking rationally. And if you're lucky, you'll learn them in maybe your second, third year of high school. That's unacceptable. It's absolutely vital we start teaching logic as reasonably early as possible. Why? Because society needs rational actors. And without some form of this logic education, a thing that we again discussed is incredibly lacking, you're essentially rolling the dice with slim odds of any proper logic and reasoning skills being the final result. Why? Because you're basically relying on parents teaching their children what they know. And as much as I love people, and the American people are very passionate people, we're anything but rational. In fact, we seem to make a devoted life to being irrational. And there is absolutely no reason a modern society shouldn't be teaching basic logic to its members, and in fact would be self-destruction to do otherwise. This in itself, if we taught basic logic, would force a major shift in our society in terms of how persuasion and fallacies and missteps in logic and reason are used. We'd have a total revolution in how advertising works. Because you may not know this, but advertising is almost dependent on logical fallacies in the American Union. It relies on you not knowing logic and reason. It relies on you not knowing this shit. It desires you to be irrational and dumb. And that, in a society, is not only self-destructive, but a straight-up insult to its own members. You should not be taking this lying down, America. This is not acceptable. Additionally, we need to talk about specialized education. Specialized education, in this case being vocational or career-building education, should begin around 7th grade. For many of you who don't have the grading system like we do in America, 7th grade is like halfway through your overall schooling. 7th grade should start with your general field knowledge of stuff. So like if you're going to be a specific type of archaeologist, this is going to start covering like geology, basic archaeology, and all that starting in 7th grade, with a gradual refinement starting to hit around high school to the point where your specific career path should basically be either ready to start when you get out of high school, or you should be ready to go into the final steps through a vocational school, college, or university, or whatever. And that should lead to mastery. But our current education system doesn't do anything of the sort. Yeah, you can pick little special extracurricular stuff that you don't have to have for specific required credits, but this is very different. We're talking a school that is specifically devoted to teaching this particular field. And we're not talking like college, we're talking high school. For example, you have many art schools that do this. What if you were to do this with, say, engineering or construction or science? You would have a far more effective, far more well-developed, and far greater skill-developed society, and the skills gap would essentially be solved right there. Or at very least, the first part of it. So what else can we do? Well, most importantly, we need to democratize education. Now, this isn't the same as school choice. And if you're in America, you're probably pretty familiar with the concept of school choice, where basically people should be allowed to choose which school they go to and shouldn't be bound by school districts. By the way, there's kind of a point to school districts if you don't know, and it kind of makes sense. But you don't want a charter voucher system. That's going to fuck your public education system even further, give you half-baked, not really effective charter schools in which people can further exploit your stupidity, or rather ignorance, we should say. If you don't have the chance to learn it, it's ignorance. And that's kind of where people want to go with charter schools, is not giving you the chance to learn. But we need to democratize education so that students, teachers, and parents all have a fair and equal say in how the school functions in the supplemental education that's considered. We're talking like PTSA organizations. Now, some places actually already start something kind of like that, and I find that rather fascinating as a concept, because you're bringing the students into the system to help give feedback and give an overall idea of how it works, and you're letting the students give an input. Now, this just needs to be taken a little bit further, and so that it can actually affect real change. Now, when it comes to basic education, such as your intro science courses, your arithmetic, math for those of you who might not know, reading and writing, logic, etc., those should be a part of a national required curriculum, with subject matter and details of those being reviewed and approved by top educators of each respective field from the top 100 colleges and universities in education in the nation state. Now, why do we go with this level of scrutiny? Because it still allows the option for healthy debate and discussion about what should and shouldn't be taught, but amongst people who actually know what the fuck they're talking about. And especially when it comes to core curriculum, which is absolutely essential no matter who you are in life. This cannot be misunderstood. This cannot be misinterpreted stuff. We need basic understanding on this from all members of society. And in that, we'd even include history. Why? Because knowing the history of your peoples and your nation state and your culture and all that is essential for figuring out why it is things are the way they are, what can be done to change them, and what your society values or doesn't value, and why. All, you could argue, essential to being a social human being. Something that, believe it or not, the public education system isn't too terrible at teaching. In fact, public education, its probably only valuable use right now, is helping people socially function. But even then, that's starting to fall to the ground. So, to sum up, the current education system sucks, and a huge part of that is trapped in the vicious cycle of politics and underpaid but extremely valuable labor, leaving it neglected, outdated, and likely inaccurate. With disinterested teachers basically running a glorified public service daycare. The skills gap is a very solvable problem, but only if actual care and effort is put into improving the education system, going forth and making sure that people have the knowledge and skills they need, rather than regurgitating the same basic history, math, or science lesson through 4, 5, 8, 10, 12, 13 years, with only adding a little bit of new information each time. Teachers goddamn deserve proper pay. They hold a job that's arguably as valuable as a doctor, but get paid fast food wages, and honestly, you have to ask yourself, critically, what the fuck are we doing? I'm even gonna go as far as, why in the hell are we paying sports athletes this much and caring so much about who gets to participate in sports, when currently, we can't even be bothered to pay for our own basic understanding of life? So maybe, instead of focusing on whether or not trans athletes or even gendered sports in general should exist on a professional level that requires pay in the 6 to 7 figure range, and start wondering why in the fuck we can't be bothered to pay the people in charge of our goddamn education a living wage. Anyways, if you made it to this point, congratulations. You have put up with probably the most well-written hot take I've had in quite a while. And, well, it was a bit of a heated issue. Next week, we're going to be talking another political concept of the month to try to get back on track with our schedule, and we're going to be talking about finance capitalism. Oh, joy! Anyways, if you loved what we had to say, hated what we had to say, or honestly think it's kind of bizarre what we had to say, but feel like people need to hear it anyway, go ahead and like, subscribe, and or share us. And those who wish not to be tread on should mind where they step. Thank you for listening. Have a great night and a pleasant tomorrow.